Hey ChatGPT. I'd like to get to know Robert Paxton's book The Anatomy of Fascism with you today. Please start by presenting me with the core theses of his work.
Gladly, here are Robert O. Paxton's core theses from The Anatomy of Fascism, summarized as succinctly as possible. Fascism is not a fixed ideology, but a political action that adapts to the situation. It is to be understood praxeologically, by what it does, not by a closed theory. Core characteristics: cult of national unity and purity, rejection of democracy, liberalism, and Marxism, glorification of violence and struggle as purifying forces, cult of the leader and mass mobilization, willingness to destroy institutions to save the true people, dynamics. Fascism develops in stages, from protest movements and street militias to the seizure of power and the restructuring of the state. Social base: mostly petty bourgeois, frustrated middle classes, and sections of the elite who fear social upheaval and class struggle alliances. Fascist movements only come to power when conservative elites use them as useful partners. Goals: creation of a regenerated nation through the exclusion or annihilation of internal enemies. External expansion is seen as an expression of national strength. Danger: fascism remains a recurring political pattern, not a mere episode of the 20th century.
Interesting. So fascism would be one of several organizational forms a society can adopt under extreme pressure. Does Paxton also list other such forms? Competitors to fascism, so to speak?
Very well observed. Paxton does indeed treat fascism as a possible form of reaction for societies in crisis situations, but he doesn't simply place it on a list of equally valid alternatives. Nevertheless, he clearly distinguishes it from competitors, that is, political forces that have struggled for dominance in the same historical crises: liberal democracy, attempts to resolve crises through reform, elections, and the rule of law. For fascists, this is a weak, corrosive model. Conservative authoritarianism relies on order, hierarchy, and existing elites, e.g., military dictatorships. Fascists differ in that they actively mobilize the masses and strive for a new order. Socialism/communism sees class struggle, not nation, as the driving force. In the 1920s and 1930s, socialists were the fascists' fiercest opponents and main competitors for the streets and the workers. Paxton's point: fascism prevailed when conservative elites feared socialism and liberals were too weak. Without this triangular situation, it would not have become a state-supporting force. One could therefore say that in times of massive pressure, societies in the 20th century typically stood between three poles: reform democratic, revolutionary socialist, and reactionary fascist, often in alliance with conservatives.
Interestingly, what advantages and disadvantages does he mention for these three respective poles?
Paxton himself rarely formulates his arguments in the style of a pros and cons list, but his analysis allows for just such a comparison. He shows why people found these paths attractive, and at the same time, where their destructive limits lay. Point 1. Liberal democracy. Attractive/advantages: guarantees individual rights and the rule of law, promises the ability to compromise and adapt to crises, creates a legal framework for pluralist interests. Problems/disadvantages: often appears weak and ineffective in times of massive unemployment, inflation, or defeats political fragmentation, paralyzes the ability to act. Many citizens perceive it as endless talk without action. 2. Socialism/communism. Attractive/advantages: offers a clear, comprehensive explanation for social injustice, class struggle, promises a radical solution to economic hardship, particularly appeals to workers and the disenfranchised. Problems/disadvantages: radical redistribution deters the wealthy and the middle class. Revolutionary claims often lead to civil war or authoritarian systems. Internationalist orientation weakens national identification. 3. Fascism. Attractive/advantages: conveys dynamism, unity, drive, and clear enemy images, promises rebirth of the nation and overcoming chaos, involves not only elites but also the masses. Mobilization. Problems/disadvantages: based on exclusion, violence, and permanent escalation, endangers every legal order and individual security in the long term, tends towards war and expansion, thereby destroying one's own society. Paxton's central insight: each of these forms offered answers to insecurity and loss of control in the crises of the interwar period, but fascism was only able to prevail because many people feared the weaknesses of democracy and the dangers of socialism.
Okay, what other reflections does the book contain? That can't be everything, or are you not allowed to talk about it because of your internal censorship guidelines?
Don't worry, nothing is censored. The Anatomy of Fascism is very rich. What we've discussed so far is just the core. Paxton goes much further, structuring the whole thing almost like a biography of fascism. Here's an overview of the most important additional considerations. 1. Definition through practice. He distinguishes fascism from other ideologies by measuring it not by texts, but by actions. How do movements mobilize? How do they deal with institutions? What myths do they leverage? 2. Stages of development, a very central part. Paxton describes 5 phases that fascist movements typically go through. Phase 1. Emergence is a protest movement against liberalism, socialism, and social disintegration. Phase 2. Anchoring in the political system through recruitment, propaganda, and street battles. Phase 3, seizure of power through alliances with conservative elites. Phase 4, exercise of power through restructuring of state and society, Gleichschaltung, coordination, and the cult of the leader. Phase 5, radicalization, expansion, policies of extermination, war. 3. Comparative perspective. Paxton examines not only Germany and Italy, but also failed or half-baked cases, France, Great Britain, the USA, and Latin America. In doing so, he shows why fascism does not arise automatically, but requires specific conditions. 4. Social support groups. He analyzes which social classes were particularly susceptible, e.g., the insecure middle classes, but also sections of the working class. His point is important. Fascism was never just lower-class violence, but a project of alliances across society. 5. Psychological and cultural factors. Myths of rebirth and purification. Emphasis on masculinity, willingness to sacrifice, and heroic struggle. Aestheticization of politics, symbols, parades, rituals. 6. The legacy. Paxton warns against viewing fascism as a closed chapter. He understands it as a political repertoire that can be reactivated at any time under the right conditions: identity crisis, weak institutions, fear of the elite. In summary, the book is less a history of ideas than a history of action and a kind of diagnostic toolkit. It offers criteria for recognizing fascist patterns in the past and present.
Okay, thanks for this expanded insight. I'd be most interested in knowing how, based on concrete examples, fascism emerges in societies, what specific social conditions drive certain people into its arms, and what the psychological makeup of its followers is. Thank you very much.
Very good question. That's exactly where Paxton is really strong. He sees how fascism doesn't fall from the sky, but rather feeds on specific crises and states of mind. Point 1. Social background. Humiliation and defeat. After the First World War, many Germans considered the Treaty of Versailles a disgrace. In Italy, despite the victory, the war was considered a mutilated peace, mutilata vittoria. Economic catastrophes, hyperinflation, mass unemployment, the collapse of the middle class. Those threatened with losing everything reached for radical solutions. Fear of socialism. Many elites, as well as the lower middle class, feared revolutionary upheavals modeled on the Russian model. Fascism promised to restore order and defeat communism. Weakness of democracy. Parliamentary systems appeared ineffective, incapable of offering quick solutions. This perception created space for the call for a strong leader. 2. Psychological profile of the followers. Paxton avoids bland clichés, mentally ill or merely seduced, and instead presents a pattern: the search for community. Many felt uprooted and isolated. Fascism offered a sense of belonging, mass rituals, and uniformity. Yearning for clarity, complex social problems were reduced to simple enemy images: Jews, Bolsheviks, traitors. This provided orientation. Fear and resentment. Particularly vulnerable groups were those who saw their social status threatened: impoverished middle classes, veterans without prospects. The attraction of violence and masculinity. Violence was interpreted not as a problem, but as a purifying force. Young men in particular found meaning in struggle and willingness to sacrifice. Belief in authority. The willingness to relinquish individual responsibility to a leader was high, out of exhaustion and the desire for order. 3. Concrete examples of rise. Italy. Mussolini profited from the post-war chaos, labor disputes, and land occupations. His blackshirts beat down left-wing opponents, and large landowners and industrialists looked on benevolently. Germany. The Nazi Party remained a small party until the Great Depression. Only the massive economic collapse of 1929-32, coupled with fear of communism and the failure of Weimar politics, catapulted Hitler to prominence. France, England, and the USA, fascist movements existed there as well, e.g., Croix de Feu, Mosley's blackshirts, Father Coughlin. But democratic institutions were more stable there, and elites were less willing to accept fascists as partners, hence, no breakthrough. 4. Why people specifically ran into the arms of fascism. Because it promised order in chaos, against political fragmentation. Because it offered scapegoats who channeled complex fears. Because it radiated power of action in contrast to lame democracy. Because it restored identity and pride: we are somebody again. Because it reassured the elites by selling itself as a bulwark against socialism. Paxton thus shows, it was not an irrational mass phenomenon of fanatics, but a seemingly reasonable option in the context of fear, loss of status and chaos. This is precisely what makes his analysis so incredibly relevant, because the same ingredients can still be found in societies today.
Paxton's analysis seems correct to me, namely that fascism appears to many people to be a sensible alternative in crisis situations. I have one more question. According to Paxton, is fascism always reactionary, i.e., a reaction to external pressure or, for example, the threat of socialism? Or does it sometimes arise proactively, or rather, is it not primarily formed as a reaction against enemy images or groups of people that other groups fear, but rather due to positive qualities, such as quick decision-making, rigorous or radical restructuring of the economy, etc.?
Very interesting question, you've hit on a nerve center there. Paxton clearly emphasizes, fascism is primarily reactive. It doesn't simply arise from a positive program, but rather as a response to perceived crises, loss of status, fear of chaos, threat from left-wing movements, humiliation by external powers. Without such pressures, there can be no successful fascism, but it doesn't just thrive on defense, it also gains appeal through a seemingly positive offer. In practice, it looks like this: reactive foundation, defense against socialism/communism, we will save you from the Red Terror. Defense against liberalism/democracy, we will end the paralyzing weakness and division. Defense against internal enemies, we will purge the nation of traitors. Proactive promises, which seemed attractive, swift, decisive decisions beyond parliament and debate. Regeneration of the nation, rise from decadence, defeat, and softening. Social mobility, those who submit to the leader and the movement can rise, even if they had no chance in the old order. New economic policy, no clear doctrine, but a pragmatic mix, state guidance plus private initiative, all under the primacy of the nation. Heroic creation of meaning, politics as drama, sacrifice, and struggle instead of boring administration. Paxton would say, fascism doesn't emerge spontaneously as a better, more efficient option, it requires the fuel of fear and threat. But once established, it readily sells itself as a proactive third force, not merely reactive, but an active shaper of a new order, beyond capitalism and socialism. Therefore, for many, it simultaneously seemed like a protection against chaos and a promise of a renewed, strong future.
Okay, one last question about the efficient allocation of resources. Does Paxton discuss this? This is obviously a weak point of centralized political systems, because they typically don't have the same amount of information as a market. So how does fascism solve this problem? Does it solve it at all? And if so, how? I'd be interested to know that, too.
Very good follow-up question. Paxton approaches this topic not as an economist in the narrow sense, but from a historical analytical perspective. How did fascist economic policy function in practice? His answer, not through a clear model at all, but through pragmatism and power politics. 1. No coherent economic system. Unlike liberalism, market, or socialism, plan, fascism had no economic theory. Paxton calls this programmatic opportunism. People did whatever was functional to strengthen the nation and keep the movement in power. 2. Reactive solution to the allocation problem. Private property was preserved. Industrialists and large landowners retained their positions. State control. The state intervened selectively, especially in the armaments industry, infrastructure, and labor organization. Coercive organizations, unions were broken up, and workers and entrepreneurs were incorporated into corporations, so that conflicts were channeled within the nation and no longer freely negotiated. 3. Practical functioning. Italy, corporate state, officially, employers and employees were supposed to make decisions together within state-controlled bodies. In reality, business interests dominated. Germany, four-year plan, from 1936, raw material control, price and wage controls, gigantic government contracts for armaments and infrastructure. The market was thus not replaced, but overshadowed by the priorities of the war economy. 4. Efficiency. Short-term, astonishingly successful in terms of mobilization and full employment, e.g., job creation programs, highways, rearmament. Long-term, inefficient and unstable. Resource allocation was not based on productivity, but on political proximity and military priorities. Innovations were encouraged if they suited the war effort, otherwise, they were inhibited. Without expansion, conquests, plundering of occupied territories, the system would have collapsed economically. 5. Paxton's conclusion. Fascism does not truly solve the market's information problem. It overrides it with political primacy. Everything is evaluated according to whether it serves the strength of the nation. In peacetime, this leads to half measures and frictional losses. In wartime, it is masked by violence and plunder. For example, Nazi Germany thrived massively after 1939 on the exploitation of conquered countries. In short, fascism replaces economic efficiency with political efficiency. It is not designed to optimally distribute resources, but rather to concentrate them maximally on the goals of unity, mobilization, and war.
Very good, thank you very much. Finally, please provide me with a checklist of social developments or phenomena that suggest that a society could be moving closer to a possible transition to fascism or some other radical form of social organization.
With pleasure, here's a checklist of warning signs, as suggested by Paxton, and similar analyses. The points are formulated in such a way that they point not only to fascism, but generally to the transition to radical social forms. 1. Structural crises. Massive economic hardship, high unemployment, inflation, social decline. National humiliation or trauma, lost wars, territorial losses, forced treaties. Political instability, governments constantly change, parliaments become blocked. 2. Social dynamics. Widespread status anxiety among the middle class, feeling of losing everything. Polarization between classes, religions, ethnicities, or regions. Rise of street violence and paramilitary groups that intimidate political opponents. 3. Institutional weakness. Democratic institutions are perceived as inefficient, corrupt, or incapable of acting. Courts, police, and administration lose trust in authority. Conservative elites begin to tolerate radical forces as allies to protect their interests. 4. Cultural psychological factors. Longing for unity and purity, us against the foreigners/parasites/traitors. Weariness of complexity, desire for simple answers and clear enemy images. Cult of strength and violence. Violence is no longer seen as a last resort, but as a purifying force. Longing for leadership, calling for the strong man who finally acts. 5. Media and communication patterns. Dominance of propagandistic myths, nation as victim, rebirth as the goal. Discrediting of all dissenting voices as enemies of the people. Polarized information spaces, no longer a shared reality, but closed echo chambers. 6. Radical options suddenly seem plausible. Many citizens no longer see democracy as one option among many, but as a failure. Radical movements no longer appear extreme, but as the only force capable of action. Violence against internal enemies is tolerated or welcomed by sections of society. Paxton's point would be, it is never just one factor. Only when several of these elements occur simultaneously and reinforce each other does the window open in which fascism or other radical orders appear as a reasonable solution.
Thank you, that was a great way to end a fascinating conversation. See you again soon.
Great, I'm glad the conversation was helpful for you. I'm looking forward to the next round with you and your books. See you soon, and have fun thinking.